Jeffrey Dahmer, a name synonymous with horror. For over a decade, he lured young men into his apartment, hiding his crimes in plain sight until a single escape exposed the unimaginable. Today, we explore the chilling story of how one man evaded justice for years and the lasting impact on his victims, their families, and an entire city. If you're interested in more deep dives into true crime cases like this, don't forget to like and subscribe for more content. Jeffrey Dahmer was born on May 21, 1960, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, to Lionel and Joyce Dahmer. His early years were marked by frequent instability in the family. His father, a chemist, was often away, either working or studying, while his mother struggled with mental health issues, leading to volatile home dynamics. Jeffrey was reportedly a quiet and withdrawn child, and he began showing signs of emotional detachment as early as elementary school. He was described as shy but polite, though he appeared to struggle with making friends and showed little interest in connecting with other children. Family members recalled him becoming increasingly isolated and apathetic. By the time Dahmer reached adolescence, these issues deepened. At around age 14, he began to exhibit more troubling behaviors, including a fascination with death. His interest grew to include collecting roadkill, which he would dissect and study in a shed near the family home. He explained these activities as a scientific curiosity, yet this morbid hobby hinted at a deeper psychological turmoil. Around the same time, Dahmer became aware of his homosexuality, but found himself unable to accept it due to the social stigma of the era. This inner conflict isolated him even more, and he kept his sexuality hidden from friends and family. His sense of isolation and confusion about his identity compounded with the challenges in his home life, leading him to seek comfort through alcohol. In high school, Dahmer began drinking heavily. Often he would smuggle alcohol into school, hiding it in containers disguised as soda. Friends and classmates later described him as a class clown of sorts, performing bizarre pranks and outbursts to gain attention. These actions, some believe, were a way to cope with his inner turmoil and mask his deep-seated loneliness. Despite his attempts to gain social acceptance, his behavior isolated him further, and his grades began to suffer. By the time he graduated in 1978, he was largely detached from his peers, family, and any future aspirations. Following high school, Dahmer's life lacked direction and purpose. Shortly after graduation, he committed his first murder, killing 18-year-old Stephen Hicks, whom he picked up hitchhiking. After this incident, he briefly attended Ohio State University, but quickly dropped out due to poor grades and continued alcohol abuse. His father encouraged him to enlist in the military, hoping that the structure would help him get his life on track. In 1979, Dahmer joined the Army as a medical specialist and was stationed in Germany. His military record was generally unremarkable, though he continued drinking heavily, which eventually led to his discharge in 1981 due to what the Army classified as unsuitability. After his discharge, Dahmer returned to Ohio, but family conflicts coupled with his drinking habits made it difficult for him to stay. He eventually moved to Milwaukee, where he took on various jobs to support himself. However, he struggled to hold steady employment, often losing jobs due to poor performance or absenteeism, largely a result of his worsening alcohol dependency. Around this time, Dahmer's inner battles with loneliness, sexuality, and control began to intensify, leading him down a dark path. His sense of isolation, combined with his inability to form meaningful connections, pushed him further into a life of secrecy and eventually a cycle of violence that would define his later years. This period of dormancy in his violent behavior came to an end in 1987. It was then that Dahmer resumed killing, marking the start of an intensified cycle of murders. In 1987, he met 25-year-old Stephen Tuomi at a bar and took him to a hotel. Although Dahmer later claimed he didn't intend to kill Tuomi, he awoke to find him dead beside him. This incident triggered a spree of killings over the next several years. Dahmer dismembered Tuomi's body and disposed of it discreetly, leaving no remains that could be identified by authorities. From this point on, Dahmer's killings escalated in both frequency and brutality, each one building on a disturbing pattern of luring victims, usually young men, to his apartment where he would drug, assault, and ultimately kill them. The following year, Dahmer killed two more victims, James Dockstader, a 14-year-old boy, and 22-year-old Richard Guerrero. His approach remained the same: offering money for photos or companionship, luring them back to his apartment, and then drugging and killing them. Dahmer's routine grew more elaborate and ritualistic as time went on. By 1989, he killed Anthony Sears, marking a point where he began keeping body parts as mementos. This step showed an increased psychological fixation with control over his victims, as he started preserving parts to relive the events in his mind. In 1990, Dahmer moved into a one-bedroom apartment at 924 North 25th Street in Milwaukee, which became the primary location for his murders. The secluded apartment allowed him greater freedom, and his killings intensified as he felt more secure. That year, he murdered 4 more men: Raymond Smith, Edward Smith, Ernest Miller, and David Thomas. By this stage, Dahmer had developed a routine of photographing the dismemberment process, keeping body parts as trophies, and occasionally engaging in cannibalism. His methodical approach allowed him to avoid detection, despite neighbors occasionally noticing strange smells or sounds. In 1991, Dahmer's crimes reached a peak, with 8 murders in just 6 months. Among these victims was Conorak Synthesomphony, a 14-year-old boy whom Dahmer lured to his apartment, drugged, and assaulted. In a tragic turn of events, Conorak briefly escaped and was found by neighbors, who called the police. However, when officers arrived, Dahmer convinced them that Conorak was his adult boyfriend, and the police left without further investigation. Conorak was returned to Dahmer's apartment, where he was later killed. This incident highlighted a failure in police response that allowed Dahmer to continue his killing spree. Throughout the first half of 1991, Dahmer's murders became increasingly disturbing. He began experimenting with different methods to exert control over his victims, including drilling holes in their skulls in an attempt to create living zombies. This morbid tactic was part of Dahmer's escalating desire to possess his victims entirely, eliminating any possibility of them leaving him. Dahmer's spree came to an end on July 22, 1991, when Tracy Edwards escaped from his apartment and flagged down 2 police officers. Edwards led the officers back to Dahmer's residence, where they discovered extensive evidence of his crimes: photographs of dismembered bodies, human remains stored in the refrigerator and freezer, and various tools used in his killings. Dahmer was arrested that evening, bringing an end to a disturbing timeline of crimes that spanned over a decade and left at least 17 known victims in its wake. Jeffrey Dahmer's modus operandi was meticulously crafted, following a pattern that allowed him to lure, control, and ultimately kill his victims with minimal risk of detection. Dahmer primarily targeted young men, often meeting them in bars, clubs, or on the streets. His approach was disarmingly simple. He offered money, companionship, or the opportunity to take photos as a way to convince them to come back to his apartment. Once inside, Dahmer would engage his victims in casual conversation, making them feel at ease before offering them a drink. Unbeknownst to them, the drinks were often laced with strong sedatives. Dahmer's goal was to incapacitate his victims, rendering them unconscious and unable to resist. After rendering his victims unconscious, Dahmer would proceed to kill them, usually by strangulation. He described his actions as a way to maintain complete control over his victims, even in their final moments. Control was a key factor in Dahmer's behavior. He later explained that he feared abandonment and was obsessed with preventing people from leaving him. This desire led him to view his victims as possessions, individuals he could keep and preserve, even if only in memory. Dahmer's complex psychological profile sheds light on these actions. He expressed feelings of extreme loneliness and isolation from a young age, which intensified during adolescence. His fascination with death and control over others developed in these early years and eventually translated into the morbid activities he carried out in adulthood. Dahmer's inability to connect with others in a meaningful way drove him to seek out a means of having people with him who would never leave. His need for this level of control crossed into an obsession with the physical bodies of his victims, leading to his practices of necrophilia and cannibalism. Necrophilia was a key element of Dahmer's actions, driven by his desire for absolute possession. By engaging in acts with deceased individuals, Dahmer felt he could maintain a permanent connection without the risk of rejection. He openly admitted that his crimes allowed him to keep his victims close in a manner that he could control entirely. Cannibalism, another element in his methods, served as an extension of this desire for control and possession. Consuming parts of his victims, he claimed, made them a literal part of him, fulfilling his disturbing need for closeness. To further satisfy his urge for control, Dahmer developed a practice of preserving parts of his victims' bodies. He kept bones, skulls, and other remains as trophies, which he displayed around his apartment. This not only allowed him to relive the moments of his crimes, but also provided him with a sense of stability. He surrounded himself with these trophies, attempting to create an environment where he felt he had finally achieved his desired control over others. In his later crimes, Dahmer attempted increasingly disturbing methods to manipulate his victims. One of his tactics included drilling small holes in their skulls and injecting them with chemicals such as hydrochloric acid in an attempt to create a living zombie. He believed that by depriving his victims of full consciousness, he could have an individual who would remain physically present but mentally subdued, fully under his control without the ability to resist or leave. These experiments, however, failed, leading to his victims' deaths. Psychologists who examined Dahmer after his capture described him as having a severe personality disorder with antisocial traits. He exhibited a deep-seated inability to empathize with others, viewing his victims as extensions of his own desire rather than as people with their own lives. He displayed a combination of obsessive-compulsive tendencies and a need for control that went unchecked, which escalated as he grew more confident in his methods. Although Dahmer expressed remorse for his actions upon arrest, his motivations remained rooted in a complex blend of loneliness, control, and a deep-seated psychological need to possess others in the most literal sense possible. On July 22, 1991, a series of events led to the arrest of Jeffrey Dahmer and the end of his killing spree. That evening, Dahmer approached 32-year-old Tracy Edwards in a bar, offering money in exchange for taking photos back at his apartment. Edwards, in need of cash, agreed, not realizing what awaited him. When they arrived, Edwards sensed something was wrong almost immediately. Dahmer's demeanor became increasingly erratic and controlling, and Edwards noticed a foul odor in the apartment. Before he could leave, Dahmer placed handcuffs on one of Edwards' wrists, making it clear that he intended to restrain him. As Dahmer attempted to cuff the other wrist, Edwards managed to evade him and kept one hand free. Dahmer then threatened Edwards with a knife, ordering him to the bedroom. Trying to remain calm, Edwards entered the room and saw disturbing signs. A large drum in the corner, various tools, and photographs that appeared to show bodies in distressing states. Edwards realized the danger he was in and carefully plotted his escape. At one point, Edwards convinced Dahmer to accompany him back to the living room, using quick thinking to buy time. Edwards seized an opportunity to push Dahmer back and escape out the door. Running out of the building, he flagged down two police officers, Robert Routh and Rolf Muller, who happened to be patrolling the area. Edwards explained his ordeal, mentioning the handcuffs still attached to his wrist and recounting what he had seen in Dahmer's apartment. Recognizing the urgency, the officers agreed to accompany Edwards back to the building. Upon entering Dahmer's apartment, officers Routh and Muller initially noticed the overpowering smell. They asked Dahmer for the key to the handcuffs, but he tried to deflect their questions, growing visibly nervous. While searching for the key, Officer Muller noticed a stack of Polaroid photos on a nearby dresser. As he looked through them, he realized the images depicted bodies in various stages of dismemberment. The photographs were taken in Dahmer's apartment, providing undeniable evidence of his crimes. Realizing the gravity of the situation, the officers immediately arrested Dahmer and called for backup. The arrival of additional officers and detectives led to a more extensive search of Dahmer's apartment, revealing a disturbing array of evidence. In the kitchen, officers opened the refrigerator to find a freshly severed human head, along with various other body parts stored in containers. Further searches uncovered 3 more heads in the freezer, as well as an assortment of human organs and flesh stored in plastic bags. In the bedroom, officers discovered an industrial drum filled with acid, which Dahmer had been using to dissolve the remains of his victims. The drum contained bones and partially dissolved body parts, serving as a chilling testament to his methods. In addition to the physical remains, investigators found a variety of tools used in the dismemberment process, including saws, knives, and drills. Among the most alarming discoveries was Dahmer's extensive collection of Polaroid photos, which documented each stage of his crimes. The photos depicted his victims from the moment they entered his apartment through their final stages, with Dahmer meticulously recording the dismemberment process. These images provided investigators with a disturbing visual record of the violence he had inflicted on his victims. As the investigation unfolded, detectives began piecing together the full extent of Dahmer's actions. Detective Patrick Kennedy, who later interviewed Dahmer extensively, played a significant role in uncovering details of his crimes. Dahmer initially resisted cooperating, but after hours of questioning, he began to confess, describing his methods, motivations, and even the reasons behind his need for control over his victims. Detectives learned that Dahmer had committed at least 17 murders, all meticulously planned and carried out with a disturbing level of detail. The discovery of the evidence in Dahmer's apartment had a profound impact on the officers and detectives involved. Many were left shaken by the sheer brutality and scale of Dahmer's crimes, struggling to comprehend the horrors they had uncovered. The evidence collected at the scene, ranging from body parts to tools to photographs, provided a clear picture of the calculated methods Dahmer had employed. This evidence ultimately became crucial in building a case against him, solidifying his responsibility for the murders and ensuring he would face justice for his actions. Jeffrey Dahmer's trial began on January 30th, 1992, after he was charged with 17 counts of murder. His arrest had shocked the nation, and the trial quickly became a media sensation, drawing extensive public attention. Dahmer pleaded guilty to all charges, admitting to the murders and providing full confessions, a decision that meant the trial would focus not on his guilt, but on whether he would be found legally sane and therefore responsible for his actions. Dahmer's defense argued that he was not sane at the time of the crimes, claiming he suffered from mental illnesses that influenced his violent behavior. This strategy sought to establish grounds for a verdict of not guilty by reason of insanity, which would potentially place Dahmer in a mental health institution instead of a maximum security prison. Throughout the trial, Dahmer's demeanor remained calm, even expressionless. He rarely showed emotion, appearing almost detached as testimonies detailed the horrific nature of his crimes. Many described his behavior as cooperative, yet unsettlingly indifferent, as if resigned to the outcome. He openly expressed a sense of remorse, claiming he wished to understand why he had committed such acts, but accepting responsibility for them. This expression of remorse was met with mixed reactions, as many doubted its sincerity given the brutality and premeditation evident in his actions. The prosecution argued strongly for a guilty verdict, emphasizing the deliberate, calculated nature of Dahmer's crimes. Prosecutors called upon medical experts who testified that Dahmer's actions were well organized and planned, noting that he had gone to great lengths to avoid detection over the years. These experts testified that Dahmer's methods and consistent patterns of behavior pointed to a clear understanding of his actions and an ability to control his impulses, indicating sanity. The prosecution presented extensive evidence, including the gruesome photographs, tools, and other items found in his apartment, to reinforce the argument that Dahmer had complete control over his actions, countering the defense's argument for insanity. The testimonies of the victims' families were some of the most powerful moments in the trial. Many family members spoke about the devastating impact of Dahmer's actions on their lives, describing their pain and anger as they relived the memories of their loved ones. Family members of victims addressed Dahmer directly, often struggling to maintain composure as they expressed their grief and outrage. Their testimonies provided the court with a clear view of the profound harm Dahmer's crimes had caused, both to individual families and the community as a whole. These testimonies also highlighted the emotional toll the case had taken, underscoring the need for accountability and justice. After 2 weeks of testimonies and evidence, the court ultimately rejected the insanity defense. Dahmer was found legally sane and fully responsible for his actions. On February 17, 1992, he was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms, totaling 957 years in prison without the possibility of parole. This sentence reflected the court's determination to ensure Dahmer would never again be free, recognizing the severity and calculated nature of his crimes. Judge Lawrence Graham, who presided over the case, emphasized that Dahmer's actions were not the product of an uncontrollable mental illness, but rather choices he had made with full awareness of their consequences. After being sentenced in 1992, Jeffrey Dahmer was transferred to the Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin, where he began serving his multiple life sentences. Despite the severity of his crimes, Dahmer was reported to have behaved relatively well in prison, largely avoiding confrontations with both inmates and staff. He initially spent most of his time in solitary confinement for his own safety, given the notoriety surrounding his case and the nature of his crimes. However, after a year in isolation, Dahmer requested a transfer to a less restrictive part of the prison. He expressed a desire for greater human interaction, indicating he felt a need to be with others despite the risks. When he was moved into the general population in 1993, Dahmer's interactions with fellow inmates became more frequent, although tensions were always high. Some prisoners reportedly taunted him, and he was occasionally threatened due to the notoriety of his case. Dahmer's crimes against young men and his acts of cannibalism made him particularly despised by other inmates. Dahmer's behavior in prison included occasional interactions with prison staff, who noted his quiet demeanor and tendency to keep to himself. He rarely showed anger or aggression, and some prison employees mentioned that he appeared resigned to his fate. He also engaged in religious activities, meeting with a minister and eventually being baptized. While some saw this as a genuine act of repentance, others felt it was another unsettling aspect of his behavior, given the nature of his crimes. On the morning of November 28, 1994, Dahmer was assigned to a work detail that included two other inmates, Jesse Anderson, who was serving time for the murder of his wife, and Christopher Scarver, who was in prison for murder. The three men were left unsupervised for a short period while cleaning a bathroom in the prison gymnasium. During this time, Scarver retrieved a metal bar from the weight room and attacked Dahmer and Anderson. Dahmer was struck multiple times in the head, suffering severe trauma. He was found unresponsive on the floor and was rushed to a nearby hospital, where he was pronounced dead an hour later. Jesse Anderson was also attacked and later succumbed to his injuries. Christopher Scarver later explained that he had targeted Dahmer because of the nature of his crimes and his reported behavior in prison. Scarver claimed that Dahmer's disturbing acts, along with his perceived lack of remorse, had made him a target. Scarver also indicated that he believed Dahmer showed a lack of respect toward other inmates, recounting instances where Dahmer would taunt them with his dark humor. This information raised questions about the effectiveness of the prison safety protocols, especially regarding high-profile inmates with notorious backgrounds. If you found this video insightful, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into true crime cases. We cover the stories, the facts, and the impact, so you don't miss any of the details. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.